The entire restaurant froze the moment the handcuffs clicked. Not because anyone understood what was happening, but because something about the way it happened felt too fast. Too aggressive, too final, like a decision had been made long before anyone bothered to ask a single question. And right there in the middle of a packed luxury dining room, a black waiter stood restrained between two security guards while a furious customer pointed at him like the case was already closed. "That's him," the man snapped loudly, his voice echoing across the room. "He's the one who took it." Phones were already up, people recording, whispers spreading, chairs slightly turning as every eye locked onto the scene. And yet, the waiter didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there with a stillness that didn't match the chaos around him. His breathing steady, his gaze focused ahead like he had stepped into a moment he had seen coming long before it actually arrived. "I didn't take anything," he said calmly. And that calmness made a few people hesitate just for a second, because it didn't match the accusation. It didn't match the image that was being painted in real time. But hesitation wasn't enough to stop what had already started. "Search him," one of the guards said, tightening his grip like the outcome was already decided. They checked his pockets, his apron, even the tray he had been holding moments earlier, and of course they found nothing, not even close to anything that could justify what was happening. But instead of slowing down, the tension only grew thicker. Because now the accusation had no proof, and yet no one wanted to admit they might be wrong. "He must have hidden it," the customer insisted, his voice louder now, more desperate than confident, but still filled with that same certainty that came from believing you couldn't possibly be mistaken. The waiter finally looked at him directly, not with anger, not with fear, just with a quiet clarity that made the man shift slightly in his seat. "You should think carefully about what you're saying," the waiter said, his tone low but firm, and for a brief moment, something in the room changed, like the balance had shifted ever so slightly. But then the restaurant manager rushed over, clearly alerted by the commotion, his face tight with concern as he took in the scene, the guards, the crowd, the cameras. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "He stole from me," the customer replied immediately, not missing a beat. "My watch is gone, and he was the only one near the table." The manager looked at the waiter, then at the guards, and in that split second, a choice was made, not based on facts, not based on evidence, but on pressure, on appearances, on everything that usually goes unspoken but always shows up when it matters most. "Call the police," the manager said. That was the moment the air shifted again, heavier this time, like something irreversible had just been set in motion. The waiter didn't react the way most people expected. He didn't plead, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to explain further. Instead, he let out a slow breath and said something that made one of the younger guards pause. "You really don't want to do that?" The guard frowned. "Why not?" But the waiter didn't answer right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the moment feel different, like it wasn't over, like it was just getting started. Because at the far end of the restaurant, near the private dining section, a door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, followed by another, both of them scanning the room quickly until their eyes landed on the scene unfolding in the center. They didn't rush, they didn't shout, they just walked forward with a kind of controlled urgency that made people instinctively move out of the way, like something important was about to happen and no one wanted to be in its path. "Let him go," the first man said, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to cut through the noise instantly. The guards hesitated. "Sir, this is a security matter," one of them replied, trying to maintain control. "I said let him go," the man repeated, his tone unchanged, but now there was no room for interpretation. The manager stepped in, clearly confused. "And you are?" The man reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and held it up just enough for the manager to see, and whatever was written on it drained the color from the manager's face almost immediately. I didn't know," the manager stammered. "That's obvious," the man replied. The guards slowly released their grip, the tension in their hands replaced by uncertainty, and the handcuffs were removed with a metallic click that echoed louder this time, not as an act of control, but as something closer to regret. The waiter rubbed his wrist slightly, still calm, still composed, like this moment had already played out in his mind long before it happened. "I apologize, sir," the manager said quickly, his voice completely different now, softer, almost desperate. "This was a misunderstanding." The waiter looked at him for a moment, and when he spoke, his words were quiet but heavy. "A misunderstanding doesn't start with handcuffs." No one had an answer for that. Not the manager, not the guards, not the customer who suddenly looked a lot less certain than he had just minutes ago. And then, just when it seemed like things might settle, one of the suited men turned slightly toward the customer and asked a simple question. "Are you sure your watch is missing?" The customer blinked, thrown off by the shift. Of course I'm sure. Check again. There was something in the way he said it that made the room hold its breath, and reluctantly, the man reached toward his coat. His movements slower now, less confident, and then everything stopped when his hand froze mid-motion, because the watch was there. Right where it had always been. Silence hit the room like a shockwave. I must have, he started, but the words didn't come together, not in any way that could fix what had already happened. The waiter didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just looked at him with that same calm expression and said, "You were saying." The customer couldn't meet his eyes. The manager stepped forward quickly, panic setting in. "Sir, we deeply apologize for this incident. It was a mistake, we will make sure." But the waiter raised his hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. "No," he said quietly, "you won't." Confusion spread across the manager's face. "I don't understand." "You will explain it?" the waiter replied, his voice steady, but not here. And that's when the second suited man spoke for the first time. "We've already contacted legal." The words landed like a final blow. The manager's shoulders dropped slightly. The guard stepped back completely, and the customer sat frozen, staring at the table like it might somehow undo everything. The waiter adjusted his sleeve, picked up the tray he had dropped earlier, and for a brief second, it looked like he might just walk away from all of it, like none of it mattered. But before he turned, he said one last thing. Not loud, not dramatic, but strong enough that everyone in that room would remember it long after he was gone. "Next time, make sure you're right before you decide who someone is." And then he walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise that had come before. Because, this time, everyone in that room had seen exactly how quickly a moment could turn, and how dangerous it was to get it wrong. The silence didn't break when he walked away. It followed him. It stretched across the restaurant like something heavy and uncomfortable that no one knew how to move past. And even the soft background music that had been playing moments earlier suddenly felt out of place. Like it didn't belong in a room where something so raw had just happened. People slowly lowered their phones, some exchanging looks, others avoiding eye contact completely, because witnessing something like that forces a kind of reflection most people try to avoid. The manager stood frozen for a second longer, then quickly turned to the guards, his voice low but tensed. "Clear this area, now. Ask everyone to put their phones away." But it was too late for that. The damage wasn't just in the room anymore. It had already escaped into the world outside, carried through those recordings, through those whispers, through the uncomfortable truth that had just played out in front of dozens of people who would never forget it. At the corner table, the man who had made the accusation still hadn't moved. His hand rested on his coat where the watch had been all along, his fingers slightly curled like he was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. The confidence he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something much smaller, something closer to shame. But even that didn't undo what had already happened. "I didn't realize," he muttered under his breath, though no one was really listening anymore. Across the room, the waiter stepped through the door leading to the back area. The moment he crossed that line, the noise of the restaurant dimmed, replaced by the quieter, more controlled environment of the staff section. But the tension didn't leave with him. It stayed in his shoulders, in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way he paused for just a second before setting the tray down on the counter. One of the kitchen staff looked up immediately. "What happened out there?" "We heard shouting." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a glass of water, took a slow sip, then exhaled, like he was releasing something he had been holding in for longer than just a few minutes. "It's handled," he said simply. But it wasn't just handled. It was something deeper than that, something layered, something that had built up over time, moment by moment, assumption by assumption. And while this one had been exposed, there were countless others that never were. Behind him, the door opened again, and the two suited men stepped in, their presence immediately shifting the energy of the room. The kitchen staff straightened slightly, sensing that whoever they weren't just regular customers. "Sir," one of them said respectfully. The waiter turned to face them, his expression returning to that same calm control he had carried out front. "It didn't have to go that far," the suited man continued, his tone careful. "It always goes that far," the waiter replied quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just truth. The second man nodded slightly, like he understood more than he was saying. "Legalists already moving forward." "The footage is everywhere, I figured," the waiter said. There was another pause, a different kind, this time, not tense, but thoughtful. Like they were all considering the weight of what had just unfolded and what it meant moving forward. "Do you want to proceed fully?" the first man asked. "Press charges. File everything." The waiter leaned back slightly against the counter, crossing his arms loosely, his gaze drifting for a moment, not unfocused, but reflective, like he was measuring something that couldn't be seen on the surface. "Not for me," he said after a moment. The suited men exchanged a quick glance. "Then for what?" one of them asked. The waiter looked back at them, and this time there was something sharper in his eyes, something more intentional. "For the next person," he said. That answer settled the room in a different way, because it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about breaking a pattern. Out front, the restaurant was slowly trying to return to normal, but normal felt different now. Conversations were quieter, laughter more forced, and every now and then, someone would glance toward the area where it had all happened, like they were replaying it in their mind, trying to understand their own role in it, even if that role had just been standing by. The manager wiped his forehead with a cloth, his movements restless, his thoughts clearly racing, because apologies in a moment like this never feel like enough, especially when you realize too late that you should have done more before things escalated. "We need to fix this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the truth was, some things don't get fixed with quick solutions or rehearsed apologies. Some things stay, they linger, they change how people see you, how they talk about you, how they remember you. And just as he was trying to figure out his next move, the door opened again, and this time, it wasn't staff or customers, it was police. 2 officers stepped inside, scanning the room briefly before approaching the manager. Their presence immediately drawing attention again, the fragile sense of calm cracking almost instantly. "We received a report," one of them said. The manager swallowed hard. It's been resolved." The officer's expression didn't change. "We'll determine that." And just like that, the situation that everyone hoped was over started to unfold again, but this time with a different energy, a different direction. Because now it wasn't just about a missing watch or a mistaken accusation. It was about what had been done in response. In the back, one of the suited men glanced toward the door, then back at the waiter. "It's starting." The waiter nodded slightly. Not surprised, not worried, just ready. "Good," he said. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the part where things actually began to matter. Moments later, he stepped back out into the restaurant. The same space, the same people, but everything felt different now. Like the illusion had been stripped away, and what remained was something more honest, more uncomfortable, more real. The officers turned as he approached, their attention shifting immediately, and for a brief second, the room held its breath again, waiting to see what would happen next. "Sir," one of the officers said, "we need to ask you a few questions." The waiter met his gaze calmly. "Of course." And as the conversation began, as statements were taken, as details were reviewed, it became clear to everyone watching that this wasn't going to be brushed aside or forgotten. Not this time. Not after everything that had already unfolded. Because sometimes, it takes a moment like this. A moment that forces people to stop, to look, to really see what's happening right in front of them, to finally start asking the questions they should have asked from the beginning. And as the night moved forward, as the truth settled into every corner of that room, one thing became impossible to ignore. The biggest mistake that had been made that night wasn't the accusation. It wasn't the missing watch. It was the assumption that no one would ever have to answer for it. And that assumption, more than anything else, was the one thing that wasn't going to survive what came next.